All right. Like we got it work. All right. Like we got it work.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Everything should be.
All right.
Everything should be.
Cool.
So you're talking about capitalism. Another thing about capitalism is I think it has an atomizing effect. I think that it's interesting. Someone who's an excellent author, Quides Veritas, who's also a commenter on my channel, uh, he pointed out that there's I forget his name. There's a German author who wrote about the distinction between the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft civilization. With one category has the sort of contractual, more individualistic atomizing civilization of like a libertarian or like a liberal left capitalist society versus a society that's sort of like a communist or a fascist or a theocratic society that's much more community based rather than contractually driven. I'm curious to hear what you think of that distinction.
I mean, I definitely think it is a spectrum. There are societies like America which are completely based around the individual and promote this absolute libertarianism and freedom and other sort of degeneracies. And then there's like the Soviet Union, just
All right, perfect. It's back working. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. It's back working again. Hello?
Hi.
All right, awesome. So you're talking about this concept of the worker. You're literally using like sort of Marxist or socialistic terminology. I'm curious, what do you think of that? Where did you are these the terms that you normally think in? And also, what are your thoughts on dialectical materialism?
So I use terms like the worker, bourgeoisie, not necessarily from a communistic perspective, but more as the perspective of a populist who's critical of both capitalism and communism and sees. All right, so apparently the mic is working. But anyway, the way I see it is the terminology that I use is collective to an extent, but I also do recognize individualist concepts. And the second thing you mentioned was dialectical materialism, and as far as I remember, is that was a Marxist variant of dialectical synthesis, the philosophy by Hegel. God, 1 second, I have to remember what that was.
I mean, it's just sort of this lens of history, basically. You know, it's this sort of material-driven lens of history that's adopted by a lot of sort of communist types, if I recall correctly, or at least that's how I've understood it. It's because if you're using terms like, I mean, generally people who use terms like the workers subscribe to what I've heard them describe as dialectical materialism. And so I could describe what they've described to me, but maybe it'd be better if anyone has any like other communist authors that they like to link me in the chat and go for it or anything. But yeah, I'm curious to hear. Well, I'm curious to hear what. Okay, you're talking about the workers in your own personal life. Has this been the experience for you? Because I feel like a lot of Jews don't find themselves in situations that would necessarily be described as workers, or at least they would probably fall into the category of what do you call it? Of like labor bourgeoisie. Is that the term? Or worker bourgeoisie, like labor elite or something like that. Like there's like
Oh,
the
I see
labor, like
what you're
there's the
saying.
labor elite. So things like basically lawyers, doctors, etc.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So like if you're a lawyer at a corporate law firm, technically you're a worker if you're not a partner. If you're like, let's say, a senior, but you're not a partner.
Yeah, I see.
You're like a worker. But you see, yeah, it's like or a doctor, shall we say? Like let's say a very highly employed doctor who works at a major hospital, let's say, is a worker,
I see what you're saying.
or
Personally,
even or even university staff. So I think that I'm curious to hear what you've had in your own experience with your life. Have you personally truly been a worker, and to what extent has your own economic status played a role in your life?
so personally, I come from for about 4 to 5 years. My family made 30,000 with 6 people. One of them was a toddler, my sister, and I'm 16 right now. And that definitely shaped how I view economics, and it did push me to the left. The concept that there are people who are suffering even more than I've ever suffered, and society forgets about them and instead focuses on these upper classes and their problems, and it forgets about the people who are actually legitimately struggling. And I've been on food stamps for a portion of my life, uh, and the way that I see it is a lot of Jews like to use the terms like
Hey guys,
bourgeoisie
welcome
and
back
the
to my
working
channel.
class.
Now before
Well,
I
they're
begin,
in the bourgeoisie, and well, they're you know making large amounts
hey
of money, and
guys,
they're from
welcome back to my
families that don't
channel.
have to
Now
worry
before
about.
I begin the video, I want to say
One
that I
second.
am not
I
trying
guess
to
the
come
volume's
across
kind of
as
low.
an ass.
All right.
I just boosted.
Cool.
It should be better for the audience now.
But yeah, there are definitely people, the upper class Jewish communists and you know socialists who like to think of themselves as working and oppressed, but really they're the ones who are oblivious to the struggles of the actual working class.
I think that, well, that's interesting because in my youth, I was a. Hold on 1 second. In my youth, how do I say? Give me 1 second. Yeah. This is better. Okay. Hello? All right.
Right.
Yeah. In my youth, I was basically a very youth, like sort of 13 to 14, maybe or so. I was actually like a self-avowed communist, like Marxist, basically. I was a Marxist, and I would go around literally like quoting and preaching Marx to everyone else in my prep school. I thought I was the smartest kid in the entire class, and I was like, oh, if you don't understand Marx, you must be an idiot, because it's like, or not even that, but like it's not even that. That's not really how I thought about it. But like in retrospect, sort of cynically, I'm sort of making it out in that manner. But no, it came from a place of basically once you realize the sort of lens that you can put on reality, it amazes you. It's kind of like to a lesser degree, it wasn't as profound of an impact because I was older and I wasn't quite as impressionable. So I didn't do crazy radical swings and tilts like that when I found out these different sociological lenses to apply. But when I found Hegel, I think it was very interesting. But I think that Hegel and eventually Hegel, no, sorry, not Hegel. I was misspeaking. When I found Hegel, it was interesting, but this wasn't the real thing. That wasn't the real thing. Firstly, it was Weber and and the other one is his name is slipping my mind. There was another sociologist I found interesting, but yeah, it was initially Weber, and hold on 1 second, I believe. Yeah, it was Weber. It was Weber. Yeah, it was initially Weber, and but then it was Spengler, really, who their sort of lenses of status. I think it was Weber. With Weber, he talked about status and there was another factor: status, class, and party. I believe he spoke of. I really can't remember the specifics, but because it was a real time ago. I was like 14 when I read this or something, or like 15. I was also taking courses in New York City at a university that specialized in sociology. That was kind of an iteration of literally an iteration of like the Frankfurt School across the pond, and it it really just changed my view. That, along with Weber, made me realize that it wasn't purely sort of a matter of economics and material affairs, along with Spengler, really making me realize that it was sort of like a sort of civilizational affair, kind of had impacts on me that much more shaped how I think now. So I'm curious, to what degree do you think it's purely material things that affect what's going on now, and to what degree what's occurring right now in modernity? For instance, a lot of the negative things that you, coming from a more traditionalist or reactionary perspective, associate with modernity. Things like, let's say, things in self-destructive personal behavior, or personal behavior that's harmful to others, pointless wars, or open borders and mass immigration, things like that. And therefore, which leads to like dissolution of people's sort of traditional identities and backgrounds and connection to themselves, and also causes a lot of nations that could be doing really well and powerfully on their own and doing well for themselves, having an elite that effectively ends up working in another nation and ends up sapping a lot of talent and the future elites of these other countries, and I think it leaves them in a bad state. So I'm curious to hear, to what degree do you think it's material factors, and to what degree do you think it's other factors that are influencing the present state of things? Because a lot of people blame it purely on other factors, like they say it's an ideological thing, which it does actually make sense to some degree. I'm just curious. I've been puzzling it out myself, to what degree what's going on right now is motivated economically or ideologically. A lot of the things, like, for instance, yeah, I don't know, like proliferation of certain types of vices, for instance, that have a lot of money behind them, lobbying one.
I mean, I don't think that we can completely separate people doing things for their own material good and ideology, because that is an ideology within itself. You know, there are people who believe that me, serving the self-interest is an ideology to be wanted. A lot of libertarians who are into Ayn Rand, and they see that as the ends. They just want more money for the sake of having more money. And they see that as an ideological point. And, there are a lot of people in modern society who have fallen into this trap where they see the material world and that analogy. They don't see anything else. They have a lens of looking at the world, and frankly, a lot of them are depressed because they think that materialism can solve their issues. And they think that they can just abandon any sense of peoplehood and identity in exchange for pushing and furthering this material belief. Like with globalism, economic globalism, and they may have economic standpoints, but people legitimately see it as an ideological value too. And I can send you something from the Ayn Rand Institute where they're actually saying these things themselves. They legitimately believe that globalization within itself will bring around somehow a better. And it's not just out of selfishness. It is, but to them, selfishness is serving the greater good. And they've kind of had to, do this weird loop around with logic to try and come to this conclusion. And ultimately, I think it's partially because they don't want to feel guilty for the starving people on the streets who lost their jobs because they wanted to make an extra dollar. And ultimately,
Sorry, go ahead.
and ultimately, a lot of these people in the bourgeoisie who look down upon the poor people and and a lot of times they don't notice them. They think of their own issues and they see globalism as good because they see more cheap stuff that they can buy that isn't even affordable to the poor people who lost their jobs because they were making it before. And it's this sort of blindness to anyone else except themselves. And I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah. You talk about globalism, but people typically associate rhetoric like support for the workers with globalist ideology, or ideology that implies somehow a globalist bent. What do you think of that?
I think it's partially a misconception of the political spectrum because there is.
I absolutely agree.
I mean, there's a nationalist variant, there's syndicalism, a national syndicalism, and then there's corporatism. And there are people who of course, will associate any sounds communistic or socialistic with globalism, and that's partially due to them misunderstanding the wide variety of political positions that can seem similar to each other and use similar terms but be completely different. And part of it is this new generation of people growing up in this sort of late stage capitalist society. They want an identity again. They want to feel like they have a purpose, and that's where we see things like identity Evropa and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is in capitalist rhetoric because they don't know anything else. They're refusing to look beyond their narrow point of view.
Yeah, I think that an elite is needed in society, but I just think that currently a lot of societies, or nearly all societies right now, seem to have the wrong elite. I think that capitalism selects for the wrong kind of elite. I think that communism prescribes the wrong kind of elite to the extent that there is an elite. And I think that a society without an elite is also bad. And I think that because people need that kind of paternalistic thing going on. I personally feel like it's necessary in my life, and I think that the community is also very important. And as well, I'm curious to hear what you think about.
I mean,
Well, sorry, go ahead.
You can finish.
No, I was also going to ask, to what degree does God play a role in the Torah, play a role in your life, and how you think, and also your political ideology?
So, the first thing I want to say is I think that a hierarchy is meant to have a functioning society, and there is that paternal need. People want a fatherly figure. They want someone they can look up to and guide them in a societal sense, because people naturally need someone to look up to. Uh, you know, and what happens is all of these systems promote aversion, which is based on greed, and it's not based on. And I understand that there are monarchist arguments about raising people from birth, but the way I look at it is, why can't we do that and make a meritocracy in which we can train people from the day they're born to be specialized into professions based on what their aptitude is? Like, say, after middle school, what's their aptitude? Are they naturally good leaders?
Well, meritocracy is one way of looking at it, but you could also see it as natural order, people simply fulfilling their natural role in society and in civilization.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think that it's society's job to help them fulfill that natural order. And I think that if we do that, then a lot of these people who are chastised and thrown away from society based on circumstances of birth, how many homeless people would be great leaders of industries and great philosophers if they weren't uneducated and stuck in a situation that they can't control because of the circumstance of their birth. We're losing out on a lot of potential.
But don't you think that somewhat, to a degree, capitalism kind of does select for something of an elite sometimes, in some ways, perhaps, not always.
In some ways, but what we have to ask ourselves is, what is that quality being produced? Are we producing the people who are going to be moral and care about their people? Or are we going to be producing the people who are willing to cut in line to try and get ahead. And I think that it can produce people who are intelligent enough to exploit markets and to get ahead and try and advocate for their own interests. But is that really the leader that society needs? Or does society care about the collective and see people as an individual at the same time while advocating for the interests of society as a whole?
Yeah.
A good
During
moral factor.
ages of exploration and ages of trade, I think that different things were selected for than in a capitalist society, but also similar things in different ways. I think that it's an interesting thing to contrast. It would be a nice conversation to have sometime, but that's a separate topic. Yeah, religion. I'm curious to hear. Are you, to what degree are you are of Hebrew descent, but how Jewish are you? I'm curious because I come from a very secular, anti-religious background. But tell me about sort of your sort of religious ideological background and where you stand now. Pardon me.
I grew up in a very modern world. We went to shul every day, or not every week on Shabbat for several weeks. Not several, geez, several years. I'm sorry, I'm very tired. It's 3 a.m. So we went to shul every week for several years, and eventually that stopped during the recession of 2009. No longer possible because we lost our shul because it's now several hours away. And so I lost a lot of faith around that time because I feel like there is, I'm questionable about if there is a God or not, but I do think that when we look at the Torah, we should look at it as sort of a guiding influence, but not necessarily an absolute. So we should take into consideration what the sages say and what our people have said for thousands of years. But at the same time, we can't get rid of the secular society in order to appease theology, because that will end up in us being guided by something that is out of our control. That can be very dangerous in certain circumstances.
Yeah. Do you distinguish at all between like the pure Torah itself and let's say the sages and the whole tradition, the oral laws and the Talmud?
So yeah, between the oral and the written Torah.
Is that a distinction that you choose to make at all, or do you really sort of view it as one large thing?
I mean, I think when we look at the sages, we have to look at it as people who each other. And the Talmud has a lot of argument in it, and it really is a lot of disagreement between the sages, whereas the Torah is as in the written Torah, is a unified, just supposedly the word of God given to the Jews at Mount Sinai, and it has a much more absolute format. So I think that people can pick and choose their sages and follow Judaism based on what Nachmanides says, and you could get into entire debates around who really is the greatest Torah authority. But at the end of the day, I think that we should appreciate the rules of our people and the tradition which was sculpted by the sages, and we should take into consideration on social policy, because to some extent, I believe without that, what really is the guiding, what is the purpose of being a nation if there's no influence from your people's culture on your society in modern day, right? Like if,
You say culture. What culture are you talking about? Are you talking about sort of Galut culture, sort of like Yiddishkeit or Judeo-Arabic or Sephardic?
Oh no, so
culture, or are you talking about a Hebrew culture, or where are you getting this culture from, if not Judaism, or perhaps looking to the Levant for a Hebrew culture?
In the manifesto, we write we appreciate that was a compromise. Personally, what I think is that we should be one unified Hebrew culture, recognizing that our place is in the Levant and we have Mediterranean heritage, and that the original Torah is the book which we have followed roughly, regardless of culture, because there is differences between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazi sages, but there's no difference in the core scripture as far as I'm concerned. So we should all of that is a unifying factor regarding social and civil policy.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry, were you talking?
No, I was just reading.
Yeah. I just wanted to say to Mitch Groupman or anyone in the chat who wants to come in, I'd love to have you in. Phil, if you'd like to join, let me know. I was talking. What was I saying? Oh yeah, yeah. I agree. I think that we should have a Hebrew culture, but specifically, I would turn to the Levant, and I would like to turn to Mizrahi Jews specifically. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I'd like to turn to. I think that Mizrahi Jews should indulge and relish in their own ancestry more, but not only that. But I think that Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews and other Jewish groups perhaps should even begin to look towards Mizrahi culture and perhaps even look towards our ancient Hebrew history from whence we were a rooted nation in our ancestral indigenous homeland of the Levant. We can look to the Hasmonean dynasty. We can look to, the Bezalel School of Art. The Bezalel School of Art is very interesting. I think that people don't look into them enough. They have some great stuff, and they had a show with some Bezalel art at the Jewish Museum that I found fascinating. But I think that we really, I think that when people talk about Hebrew culture, often there's this conception of the new Jew. I think that there's this desire to be a bridge between Europe and the West, or I believe it was Herschel who said something along the lines of we need to avoid Levantization. We need to be like de-Levantize ourselves, which is interesting. Why must we de-Levantize ourselves? Why can't we be both Levantine and civilized? You talk about Spengler distinguished between the Apollonian, sort of northern and western, northwestern, the northern Levant, the sort of Mediterranean civilizations, and the eastern and southern ones, and specifically the eastern ones. I think that this is a distinction that I would somewhat like to make as well, because although I do think that there is like a Mediterranean people, I also think that there is a there's an East Mediterranean people, basically, and I think that we're cousins, as it were, as we say in Hebrew. I think that the Afro-Asiatic people, perhaps even more broadly, I think that we need to look to that tradition, and that this is something that Jews often tend to avoid. And I think that this is a tendency with Ashkenazi Jews. They don't like it. I think that it's interesting. I was looking into some Afrofuturist content and material recently, and I saw some Afrofuturist productions and art shows and music and film festivals in New York actually recently, and I found it really, really fascinating. And I think that we need sort of a Judeo or Hebreo or sort of a Levantine West Asian futurism. We don't. I think that perhaps a very powerful and dynamic form of civilization would be one that looks to traditional systems like monarchy and religious governments. A divine monarch, perhaps even appointed by God, if we get lucky enough again. I think that we could really have a much more moral and healthy civilization if we used the traditional systems and combined it with modern technology. We don't need to, because I think that perhaps we would even accomplish more things than what would get done under a capitalist government, or let's say one of the sort of very maternal type socialist / communist societies that's all about, oh, we need to help all the people in need here to the nth degree before we, let's say, do anything, go into space or accomplish anything grand. But I think that there is not a compromise, but I think that traditional civilization is dynamic, and it is the way. And I think that Jews need to embrace the sort of Levantine nature of their Hebrew identity. I think that will make us stronger. And I think that people also overvalue Europeanness vis-a-vis Jews. People always say, oh, Ashkenazi Jews are so smart. Ashkenazi Jews have high IQ, and that's true. But they don't know the IQ comes from a selection process. It doesn't just come from their European heritage. A lot of people make it out as if the fact that they mixed with Europeans gave them their high IQ. It's like, no, the high IQ arose from a selection process, not just European heritage. The European heritage is a secondary factor, or tertiary, perhaps even possibly. So it's like, So I don't know. I think that we can be a great civilization, and we can be an intelligent and wise and and grand civilization without necessarily being Western, and specifically values a lot of values that come from the Enlightenment. Not necessarily all of them, but I think that a lot of them can be, re-examined and questioned and have a critical eye turned on them. What do you think?
First off, I do want to say that uh, I am very much against the sort of Europeanization and the Yiddish culture concepts. And frankly, I think that we should move towards the Levant as our inspiration for our people. However, Mizrahi Jews, I feel like there are foreign influences that happened on them by Arab culture and the likes, which have negatively influenced the pureness of their Levantine ancestry. Whereas if we look further back and we look towards the origins of our people in David, in the tribes and whatnot, what we can find is we can find a lowest common denominator, and I think that would be much easier to rally people around. Let's return to our roots, and let's the depression and the failure of our people in the exile and the divisionary nature of the exile, and let's instead unify around our people's history. But regarding things like monarchy, I'm much more secular than that, because personally I think that religion as a should be relegated to cultural impact as well as some legal impact, as in we can look towards the Bible as a guiding authority on things like civil law, marriage, things like that, as an influence on our social society. But when it comes to things like government systems, I would much prefer a system in which people are trained from a young age to fulfill on their aptitude, because I feel like that would be much more effective. People have a much fairer chance at achieving their true potential.
Yeah. Hold on one sec. Interesting. So, you think that? All right, we can go into that in a bit. What do you think of monarchy? Because you were making some semi-monarchist arguments. I'm curious to hear if you approve or not of a monarchic system of rule, because there are ways to integrate monarchic or elitist or even theocratic civilizations with meritocratic components. In fact, naturally, some of those things did exist in those societies to some degree. I mean, they weren't completely devoid of those things. I mean, you couldn't just become, let's say, a Kohan or a Levite, but there were ways in which you could, integrate yourselves into the higher echelons of one of those systems without necessarily being of that background. Although you couldn't fully, but you see what I mean, right?
So I'm against monarchy as the absolute leadership. I think that the absolute leadership should be meritocratically appointed ruler with long-term and near absolute power relegation. However, I do see the value in sort of the how do I say this? Sort of the tribalistic integrity, put it, of keeping in things like the Levites and the Kohanim in order to sustain Jewish culture in a social sense. So we can glorify our people's history by continuing on those traditions, and perhaps the government somehow, if we would be much easier. But what I mean is bringing
How do you
back
meritocratically select them? I'm curious, like democratically, or
no. So basically, what you would do, leader of each guild, and when people were young and they passed an aptitude test, they would be put into a guild, and the guild leader would report to a higher command, something like a supreme leader, appoint the next leaders of the guild, and then when the top leader dies, what would happen is the guilds would get together to appoint a new leader. It's a
How
little
do you feel about
complicated.
apprenticeship systems compared to modern educational systems, like which are uniformly forced upon people in countries like a lot of first, second, and even third world countries, ranging from America to Israel to all over the world, have the same similar levels of metrics and credentials, even though they don't necessarily translate over perfectly. The schooling system and format seems to be rather uniform, and I know that there are technical terms in different camps of schooling, but most of them are derived from this sort of Western post Western sort of school of thought of like sitting in a classroom rather than apprenticeship type scenarios, which while they do exist aren't really as common. What are your thoughts on that?
So in the U.S. there are I forget what they're called, but there's high schools which are dedicated to training people practical skills. Um, I forget what their name is. Anyways, I'm completely for an apprenticeship system that is relegated by the state and allows for people to be integrated into their future occupation through mentorship and guidance by already skilled professional. So, for instance, if someone chose aptitude in technology, they should be put on a technology track and trained by or established in the technology field to guide them through and make them the best that they can be, because that is a much better educational system. It allows people to have someone they can look up to, and I think they would learn far more effectively than just sitting them down and saying, take the standardized test until college. And I see that as highly ineffective.
Mitch Groupman says he wants to join. I'm going to see if I can invite him. Hold on. You can keep talking. If there's anything in particular you'd like to talk about, talking about more about your ideological background. Where do you come from historically? Were you in the left, on the right, libertarian, communist? Talk about. You can also talk about your personal history and how that's impacted your life. Like, for instance, your own economic background. You said you struggled. You said you had to be on food stamps at a point, which must have been terrible.
So at one point I was like pseudo libertarian. That lasted very shortly, but I think when I was like 13 or 14, I got into Kahana, and I was really into the capitalism aspects of it as sort of a reaction to a lot of the sort of ultra left wing, which at the time seemed, reactionary to me. And then I don't know how to explain this. As our economic system, as our, how do I say this? As our financial state worsened, and as my family just started, falling down deeper, and I became more aware of this and I knew what was going on, I started to look towards different systems and how those have played a role in people's lives, specifically corporatism, and how a structured economy that was not just based around what is it called again? Yes, and a free for all, switching to a more structured and state controlled economy with individual choice, but at the same time with a guiding father figure in the economy, which can ensure people's ability to have stability. Because for a lot of families, not having stability can really hurt children and diminish their abilities in life by getting rid of any hope they have. And I think that that's a very dangerous situation to be in, and that capitalism
Sorry, so this is the first time I've used Google Hangouts in this format for streaming, so I'm just going to click around and try to figure things out. So this is a total disaster.
Your volume's a bit low. Is there any way you could turn it up?
How is this? Any better? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Hello?
Okay, yeah.
All right, awesome. So anyway, I've seen your name before, I believe on the Luke Ford streams. You are a Jew, if I'm not mistaken, as well. A fellow member of the tribe. Are you still here? I think you just left. Oh, shit. Well. Hold on. Do you think he's having some connection issues? Yeah. Anyway, if he sorts that out, that's cool. But hold on. I just realized. Give me 1 second.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I keep clicking the hang up button.
Don't worry about it. Anyway, hello. How do you find my channel?
Hey,
Welcome.
so I think I've come across Luke Ford a bunch of times. As I mentioned in Luke Ford's channel offhandedly, I'm just like a random heterodox Jews who's been looking for and like sort of collecting other heterodox Jews because there's like so few of us. Ideologically, like I'm a fairly boring milquetoast centrist, but I'm interested in like radical and fringe ideas and how they, might sort of rub off on Judaism. And I noticed you seem like precisely like the sort of specimen I'm looking to collect.
Brilliant. Yeah. It's always good to keep in touch with fellow thinkers. Are you familiar with this fellow here, Shimon or Shimonism, or perhaps reactionary Jew, who's someone who I worked with at a very early point? I know you know Luke
not from
Ford.
before the stream, no.
Yeah, and do you know Jakey or Duvid, perhaps?
No, I don't know anyone. I only started tuning into Luke's stream after he started, after that interview he held with Nathan Kaufness.
Ah, I see. Yeah, that was very interesting. He had a series of fascinating discussions about Nathan Kaufness. I believe he had both Professor to be and professors, respectively, Kaufness and McDonald on his show, both subsequently in a period of about a week. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, unfortunately, they didn't get a chance to talk to each other. I would pay anything to talk to Kevin McDonald on his stream. I feel like I have a lot of pointed questions I'd like to ask. It's actually sort of one of the reasons I've gotten interested in the sort of anti-Semitic right-wing fringe is precisely because I feel like no one before Nathan Kaufness has really bothered to try to address Kevin McDonald. And so people on the alt-right have like sort of assumed that his work is unimpeachable because it went unchallenged for so long. So like I'm really interested in like listening to what the alt-right has to say about Jews, reconstructing like the best version of it, and then hopefully coming up with an effective rebuttal if that version is in fact incorrect.
How would you feel if perhaps there are some critiques that are valid of the diaspora? Because I think that there are plenty. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
Inherently,
sorry.
Insofar as the diaspora exists, I think that there might be some valid critiques. I think that it makes us, even in the context of, let's say, what we were talking about earlier, there's a very interesting quote that by A.D. Gordon, where he talks about the fact that the diaspora, sort of the fact that it divorces us from land, it divorces us, I think, from certain types of virtue and from being able to have certain types of societal experiences that, let's say, other people who might be more connected to the land might have. For instance, and I also think that super cosmopolitanism might not be healthy. And I think that it might end up with a lot of people having negative values. Like, for instance, me, I grew up in basically between Manhattan and London. My life was super, sort of like, yeah, it was just typical. I mean, it was good. Like my family my family, I mean, was great, but as good as they could be. But it was like it was just set in the context of this very pervasive sort of sinister ideology that I found absolutely everywhere. That just absolutely revolted me on a very gut level. I couldn't quite explain why until I was partway through my teen years. I began to try and find explanations.
Well, you sound significantly more naturally conservative than I am. I'm still sort of wedded to whatever that ideology is. Like I consider myself, and have always considered myself, a fairly rootless cosmopolitan. Like that shoe definitely fits. And I'm not. While I've definitely like started to lean more conservative as I've gotten older, I'm not sure I'm that far to the right yet that I would agree with you on some of your. I mean, like it's not that I would disagree on your assessment of the Ashkenazi diaspora. It's like that I would probably disagree on like the value judgment you make about it, like whether it's ultimately good or bad. That's something I'm less certain about. I'm not really like, I don't even know what the right word is, but I would say that I'm not really any sort of Jewish nationalist, although right, so I'm like leaning in that direction more. But for the time being, I feel I'm still like a fairly bog standard neoliberal, precisely the sort of person who you would probably like count as a Jewish degenerate.
I'm curious. How do you find Luke Ford initially?
I don't know. I mean, I've done like a preliminary sweep of a bunch of right-wing Jews, like far-right Jews, and I found like, do you know that guy? What's his name? Jew Among You?
Yes, I've been following his blog for what must have been at least 5 years, probably like 6 or 7 years, maybe even 8 years. It's been. I feel like I've been following his blog. Probably not 8 years. I feel like I've been following his blog for like 7 years, like probably as long as I've been following Fringe Elements, which is like a decade almost.
Extremely impressive. You should be like a guest blogger there. Yeah, no. So I've been like following the far right since about early 2013ish when I first found out about neo reaction from this other blog I follow, and then I just sort of like went down the rabbit hole from there, and somehow I came across in like my searches for responses to Kevin McDonald, of which there were pitifully few back then, and still, but less so. I somehow came across Luke, and then I just forgot about him for an indefinite period of time, and then a few weeks ago started watching again because of.
What do you think of neo-reaction and monarchy? Because I was just talking about monarchy with Shimon.
I mean, I don't know where you stand on Trump, but as a boring Democrat, like it's like his election is something. It's not the end of the world, but it's like fairly close. So if the argument is that democracy is inherently unstable and leads to these absurd, terrible choices, because the political parties are basically only trying to spite one another, I'm a lot more sympathetic than I was like in 2015, let's say. But I'm still not all the way there. Like the fundamental problem, which I still have never seen satisfactorily addressed, is that like the good thing about democracy, for me at least, is not that you can choose who you want to be leader, but that there's like a constitutional way to remove people from power. Like Trump may be bad for me, but lifelong Trump whose power is enshrined in the Constitution, like that would be my nightmare scenario. So as long as like I have not like, so I'm more sympathetic to like the patchwork and, like fragmentation aspect of neo-reaction. Like maybe a national divorce really is, the best thing for everyone to avoid civil war. But in terms of like the actual monarchical core or undemocratic core, I'm not yet persuaded.
Yeah, I have my own cases for monarchy, and I can make those in a bit. But I'm curious, Shimon, do you have anything to say to our guest? Shimon?
Hi. It's interesting to me to see people engaging from the outside, to our sort of movement at this point. And it really is inspiring to see that people are willing to listen, even if they don't necessarily agree, or may not even be sympathetic, but are willing to listen to what we have to say, and possibly in the future might agree with us from listening to our arguments and listening to our points of view.
Well, I'll bring all my friends if I can.
I'm curious to hear what both of you think about cosmopolitanism, the upsides and downsides, and alongside with things like, let's say, all the things that come alongside cosmopolitanism, the sort of general set of proto-enlightenment and enlightenment values that generally come alongside it. But we can start with just cosmopolitanism. The idea of cosmopolitanism, being a citizen of the world, or a person of the, like a dweller of the world, sort of, yeah. You know, your city is the world, basically. Or your polity, your polity is the world, sort of.
I've been monopolizing the conversation, so I don't want to.
Either of you can start. I don't mind.
Well, like it or not, I am a cosmopolitan, so I can't really diss it too hard. I mean, just like if you define a cosmopolitan as someone, you know, a Western cosmopolitan, let's say, as someone who has more in common with, you know, upper middle class British or Germans or Scandinavians than they do with, you know, the rural backcountry of their own nation, then I just like am like it's not even like fuzzy or ambiguous. I am just like purely cosmopolitan. I am just like your average like HBO watching, book reading, you know, college educated New York Jew. I used to like before I started exploring like some far right material, like I thought that this was like just obviously the correct way to live. Like I just felt nationalism was incredibly stupid because like it's a total accident, right? Where you're born. It seems like a completely arbitrary thing to base your loyalties on. But yeah, now I've been starting to see nationalism as a little more inevitable than I thought it might be. And I'm coming to understand it's, sorry, I'm watching the chat. Again, I'm very new to this, so I'm a little distracted. I'm starting to see like the arguments against it, or appreciate the arguments against it a lot better.
Interesting. And what are your thoughts, Shimon?
I'm assuming that the cosmo sort of internationalist, citizen of the world thing. So approaching it, I think that it's a light version of treason in that it's passive. It's an idea, necessarily something that people act on by, you know, going out and burning flags and whatnot. But it is a corrosive fabric that leads to the people in the society.
So you think it's basically fifth columnism light? I think to a degree, it's some cosmopolitanism is somewhat inevitable in small circumstances, and there will always be a small amount of people who are sort of this group who are very open to new experiences and looking for that. But I don't think that that group should necessarily be mainstream to be the norm, because I think that most people aren't naturally predisposed to that sort of behavior or thinking necessarily. I'm curious to hear what both of you think of this quote. I'm going to read off the quote that I think was pertinent to some of the earlier sections of this conversation. But I think that this, although it comes from a very materialist standpoint, speaks to me to a large extent. He said, A.D. Gordon writes, "The Jewish people have been completely cut off from nature and imprisoned within city walls for 2,000 years. We have been accustomed to every form of life except a life of labor done at our behalf and for its own sake. It will require the greatest effort of will for such a people to become normal again. We lack the principal ingredient for national life. We lack the habitat of labor, for it is labor which binds a people to its soil and its national culture, which in turn is an outgrowth of the people's toil and the people's labor. We, the Jews, were the first people in history to say, for all the nations shall go each in the name of God, and nations shall not lift up sword against nation. And then we proceeded to cease being a nation ourselves. And then here's another quote. We are a parasitic people. We have no roots in the soil. There is no ground beneath our feet. We are parasites not only in an economic sense, but in spirit, in thought, in poetry, in literature, and in our virtues, our ideals, our higher human aspirations. Every alien movement sweeps us along. Every wind in the world carries us. We ourselves are almost non-existent. Of course, we are nothing in the eyes of other people either. And I think that this quote, both of these quotes are very interesting and poignant to me, even though I don't necessarily agree with them fully or agree even with especially where he's coming from. A.D. Gordon was a much more sort of Western materialist thinker than I am. But I think that these are interesting quotes to take into account because I think that sorry, I'm a little just kind of woozy just because of still having after effects of the recent surgery, so I'm never really quite that coherent. But I think that Jews have had an interesting and different connection insofar as we are a cosmopolitan people and a diasporic people with land and with feeling at home in a place. And to some extent, this has caused positive things, like, for instance, there are some things that some could say are positive. For instance, a progressive perspective or an anti-reactionary, anti-traditional in some instances, or not even anti-traditional, but sort of anti-in-group traditional thing, or anti-nationalist perspective, if you think these things are good. And it's also caused us to have it's also caused us to be very vis-a-vis the job restrictions and other things, and being unable to own property causes us to be selected for higher.
So I think you called yourself like a romantic Jewish nationalist. Is that right?
Yes, I tend to go away from the term nationalism because it implies the Westphalian nation state. But when I say nationalism, I mean sort of what I call like an ethnarchist or an identitarian or something along those lines.
Sure, but I just mean like I definitely hear like the note of romanticism.
Yeah.
In those two quotes that you read, like, you know, the glorification of, you know, labor and self-reliance and self-sufficiency, and peoplehood. For me, like, I don't know, I've never found those arguments that persuasive. Maybe it's because, like, I don't know, I've always just felt super comfortable as just like, you know, a normal, deracinated, atomized person in the West. I never felt like a huge pressing need for, you know, group identity. And I never really felt until a few years ago that I could even come to understand why some people would need those things. I guess things are changing, but yeah, like for me, like the impetus to Jewish self-sufficiency and self-reliance and nationhood and all those things is not so much like, we've been sort of domesticated in a bad way by not having these things over the centuries. It's just that, like, it's rather like we might need these things because, you know, our host nation may spontaneously decide to murder us, and so we need somewhere to escape to. That is unfortunately like the argument that I find more powerful. But if you gave me some sort of like, you know, guarantee that, you know, the alt-right would never come to power and try to ethnically cleanse us from America, like I would just want to stay in America forever. And I would invite all of my Jewish, you know, cousins to come live here, although most of them died in the 40s, unfortunately. I realize that this probably puts me very much at odds with your politics, but I'm willing to have my mind changed.
You don't like the vision of sort of I don't know, like super futuristic, like
I do. I just don't think
Jewish elites walking around with like you know, flying ziggurats and like wearing like nano weave fiber dish dashas and stuff like that.
On the contrary, I think you can realize that much better in the United States. Like, you know, if by the way, are you going to be putting this on YouTube, like recorded version?
Yeah, I can save a version of it after the fact.
I was hoping to say you'd say no, just so that like I don't have to monitor as carefully what I'm saying, so that it doesn't get like saved in posterity.
I can make it unlisted after the fact, so that only the people who have the link can see it.
Sure. All right. Yeah, like
Okay,
it's
so
possible.
save the link to it now.
Yeah, like it's possible that we've developed like relatively high intelligence to other ethnic groups. I can't say for certain. Like I wouldn't be shocked either way if, this American Psychological Association, came together and announced a consensus that they had, definitively proved or disproved that theory. But like, given that it's true, which I assume is something that you accept and much of the alt-right accepts, like we're much better off cultivating our intellect in the US, where we don't have to like waste half our population doing like, or more than half, like 9/10 of our population just doing the grunt work of maintaining the infrastructure of civilization, don't you think?
Yes, probably. That probably is the case, but I am not sort of an IQ nationalist. And again, partially, this is somewhat of my bias as a Mizrahi Jew, albeit a relatively high IQ Mizrahi Jew, I think, if I'm not mistaken, by average standards. But if you go by the old statistics that were gathered, not sure how accurate those are, but it's like I'm again, it's sort of the more romantic thing. I'm not really much of an IQ fetishist, although I do agree with that theory, and I think that IQ can be. I think that there are ways to cultivate. Maybe again, it's sort of this romantic thing, but I think that I would rather be self-sufficient and have an average lower IQ in an autonomous state with a more traditional, quote unquote, healthier, as I would see it, manner of living than be effectively diasporic with very high IQ and very high standards of living. I mean, maybe unless that there were like these sort of autonomous Jewish communities like shtetls in America. I mean, I'm okay. Okay, see, the thing is, I don't really like the fact that there is effectively a brain drain for our people. I don't like that there's a brain drain for a lot of peoples in Africa and Asia, of African and Asian or non-European origin, basically into the West and into America. I also don't like the fact that a lot of these people are being turned into people who effectively, act as sort of destabilizing fifth columnists, not only to their own people for sort of like globalist stuff and sort of don't help out their own people that much, but also they also are sort of anti-Western, anti-white, anti-nationalist in the context of being a minority group, which effectively makes them a massive liability for those of us who just want to sort of self-determine and be left alone and not really have this sort of eternal, let's say in the instance of my life, conflict of Jews with the West. I don't really think that that's a battle worth fighting anymore, personally.
Well, in some ways, I think the brain drain is higher in Israel, but I'm not sure brain drain. I understand what you're talking about. No,
that's what I mean. So like Israelis move to America. A lot of them right now are in New York. In California and SF, there's tons of them. It's a tragedy, I think. I mean, yeah, I see why, but like I think Israel can take steps to mitigate what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, worse than the fact that they're just moving here from like a Jewish nationalist perspective is the fact that they're basically all intermarrying, with non-Jews, like secular Ashkenazi Jews in America and most of the West really are just, outside of Israel, are just totally going extinct. That does seem sad to me in a sort of ecological way, in the same way that I'm like sad that the spotted owl might be going extinct. But I don't know if it's enough to like stir me into action.
They keep the most dangerous part of their identity, though. The largest thing they identify with is "quote unquote" remembering the Holocaust. And I'm not trying to downplay the importance of the Holocaust. On my Ashkenazi side of my family, like there are people who whatever, like I think had some involvement in World War II or something like that. Like I'm not saying like that isn't something that's worthy of talking about, but the way it manifests itself is it's an anti-Western thing. When you say, oh, we remember the Holocaust, what they mean is we remember that effectively the Westerners are the enemy. And I see the way that things like that are sort of politicized in this grander sort of mythos and narrative of basically fuck whitey, for lack of a better term, narrative. Like this is something that I went to a private prep school in New York City that had a lot of Jews in it. Like I think my class was like around 50, maybe 40 to 60% Jewish. kids at various times, and even though it wasn't officially Jewish, like I remember, like there was this one particular teacher who really was sort of very at it with the whole anti-white thing, and then I noticed there was like this consistent trend, and then I noticed the same thing, kind of exists in my family and all my inner circles, and it's like I don't really, I feel like it's not just that. I feel like it's actively like there's conflict. I feel like being in diaspora makes there to be conflict. I feel like it's almost kind of like comparable to like the way that there's this resentment amongst a lot of blacks. I think that there's a lot of resentment sort of amongst Jews, not on quite the same level, but it's a bit more of like a low down thing that isn't necessarily explicitly talked about as much. But in a lot of circles that I run, and especially in a lot of academic circles with a lot of Jews that I know, although they don't implicitly have this as their Jewish identity, but someone who's, let's say, 1/4 of Hebrew heritage, their main identity will be basically like anti-traditional, anti-Western, and I think that's kind of sad. That's a waste of intelligence, even if you're looking at it from a purely materialist IQ standpoint. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't even know how to put this because I don't want it to be offensive. But again, granted the premises of the alt-right, like, what do you think about supposedly high IQ Ashkenazi Jews marrying into lower IQ other ethnicities? I mean,
it saddens me unless they're Levantine and they become Jews.
Well, I mean, suppose they are Levantine and they are Jews. Like, do you worry about?
Into Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews? Yeah, I don't mind that. I don't mind that at all. I don't mind that at all. I actually kind of support that, but I can go into that. But only if it's.
I don't want to like offend you at all by
suggesting. Oh no, I'm not offended. I don't care. I am low IQ. Listen to what I'm saying on the stream. But like, I don't mind. But I actually support that because I want there to be a unified Hebrew identity. I was talking about this earlier. Sorry, go ahead.
That totally terrifies me because we're surrounded by enemies on all sides who outnumber us by an order of magnitude or so, or two. Like, our one weapon is like our intellect, and if we give that up, then I'm totally like uncertain and scared of what the future holds for us in Israel.
Okay, that's reasonable, but I think that I'm not against the idea of preserving necessarily a high IQ elite, but I don't think that the high IQ elite should necessarily be preserved qua Ashkenazim. I think that it should be preserved as a high IQ elite rather than an Ashkenazi elite. Although, again, I have my obvious personal biases, and perhaps this shouldn't necessarily be the case. And I'm not making any rules or anything here. I'm sure Shimon has his own prescription. In fact, Shimon, if you'd like to weigh in on anything that's been said so far, please go ahead.
All right, so there are a few things I want to say. The first one is, when we talk about, the statistics about how a lot of Jews are basing their Jewish identity on the Holocaust, personally, I think that we need to stop caring. We need to look forward. That we'll be able to move forward as a people is if we stop looking at ourselves and we start looking at ourselves as possible victors, and then in that way we can move forward and move towards the victory and redemption of our people. When we look at ourselves as a strong and independent nation. And the second thing I wanted to say was, I forget. I'm very tired right now.
Don't worry about it. If you remember it, please speak up. But if you don't have anything else to say, then go ahead, Mitch. Please, I didn't mean to cut you off a bunch of times earlier. I just couldn't help but interrupt. I'm very much like that. Please feel free to interrupt me anytime.
Sure. One of the things that... All right, so I mentioned that I'm interested in fringe ideologies in general, and it doesn't only apply to the American right. I'm also interested in the horrible Marxist-Leninists on the far left. Or
same, absolutely same. Yeah. I watched a lot of communist videos.
Yeah, me too. It's incredibly fascinating, but it doesn't stop with them either. I'm super interested in Islamist movements. I'm interested in radical feminists. I'm also super interested in flat Earth theorists, and I actually know more about flat Earth than anyone I've ever met. I could go on about the flat earthers for hours. They're my favorite group of people in the world. But for the most part, I haven't been very actively persuaded by any of these groups, except for one, which is the transhumanists. And I consider myself relatively transhumanist. And one of the reasons why I object sort of ethnic nationalism so far is just that I feel it's going to become irrelevant once we embryos start exploiting embryo selection en masse, which I consider more or less inevitable. Like the biological distinctions that are necessary to prop up this sort of social categories is just going to disappear within a century or so. So like, what's even the point? I realize that this makes me sound kind of kooky.
No, it doesn't actually. I've heard this expressed before. And there's some, like, even gene editing is sort of becoming closer to becoming reality. Whether we should do it is totally entirely different matter. But were you drawn by any chance to the sort of transhumanist wing of neo-reactionary movement?
No, it was like the other way around. I started on, okay, don't judge me for this. I don't consider myself like one of these guys, but there's like a growing movement on the internet called the rationalists. They started on a site called Less Wrong, which is, I don't want to.
I know less wrong. I know less wrong.
Okay, yeah, I know it's fairly embarrassing, and like they're kind of crazy in a bunch of ways. But there's this one blog that's sort of stemmed off of that subculture called Slate Star Codex, and the author is a psychiatrist who like has an unusual gift for writing and a lot of breadth in terms of the subject matter he covered. So he wrote this like really long like devil's advocate defense of neo-reaction, and that's how I sort of got myself started in this universe. I quickly moved on to like Nick Land and Mencius Moldbug and a few others. Mostly as an observer rather than like as an acolyte who actually buys into this stuff.
That's really interesting. Do you have any thoughts on NRX, Shimon? I don't think he's alive. Hold on. Anyway, give me one moment.
I think he's back.
Shimon, do you have anything to say? Yo, can you hear me? Hold on. I think this might have disconnected. Or not.
I can hear you.
Hold on. Yeah, awesome. All right, so Shimon seems to have dropped out.
I'm sure.
They're definitely characters, and I think that the fact that neo-reaction, that it was such a character-ish or a movement that focused sort of as a clusters of individual blogs. I mean, this had to do somewhat with the blogging platforms that it was largely based off of. But I think that this kind of hindered the movement from being a mainstream thing. But of course, they didn't want it to be mainstream. That's part of the sort of elitist nature of the thing,
right.
You know. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think characters is exactly the right word to describe it. Like, I have this sort of like, I didn't read that much of Moldbug, but I read a lot of Nick Land, and like, I just have this sort of like, I don't even know what the word is. It's like a semi-ironic love of him. Like, it's sort of my attitude towards Zizek, which is like he's this mischievous, ridiculous, postmodern like dance routine, and it just makes me laugh and entertains me, and I don't take it super seriously. I don't know how much you've read of Nick Land's writings, but it's like absurdly opaque and hilariously written. Because like I don't know if you read that much continental philosophy, but it's like written in this like bizarre Deleuzian style that I didn't even know still existed. It's great. I don't know. It makes me I guess I'll just say that my impression is that it's extremely amusing, and that's really all I have to say about it.
Yeah, I personally find his style of writing kind of yeah. I mean, I have a lot to say on Nick Land. I can actually talk about this in a bit, but Shimon's actually is about to go to sleep. It makes sense considering it's like 4:20 a.m. in the morning. So if you have any parting words, or if you'd like to advertise your work at all, or let the audience who's listening right now know where you can get in touch or follow up.
Sure.
All three people.
Yes, of course.
Please, show your stuff, Shimon.
You're talking to him.
Shimon, yeah. No, oh, not you. I'm not going just yet, Mitch.
Sorry.
I actually have some more questions for you. But Shimon, do you have any last words or any stuff that you'd like to share with the audience?
Thanks for having me. Very tired. But if you want to see me on Twitter, it's Shimon_Kach, Kach. And I will be posting a link to the manifesto there because I couldn't in the chat for some reason on the YouTube video. So that's it.
And I'll post a link to it under the chat. Hold on. Yeah, I can. If you just send it to me in Discord, I'll post a link to it under the video. Okay?
All right, cool. Second.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
All right, hold on just 1 second, Mitch. So coming from sort of a cosmopolitan urban background yourself, I assume you are from a secular or reform background, maybe conservative.
Very much so.
All right.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I mean, so we went to a technically conservative synagogue, but of course I grew up in a very irreligious, secularist milieu, and I dropped out of Hebrew school when I was 11. So it had basically, before I got my bar mitzvah, so it had basically no real impact on my life. And this is something I'm kind of starting to regret. Like, I definitely see the value of religion more than I did when I was young, but like, I definitely more or less had no use for it and just considered myself like a random white person, like maybe an ethnic white, but just generic white with no real attachment to Judaism beyond like, distant memories of, my cousins being killed in the Holocaust. That was like all Judaism really meant to me, which was to say not very much.
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, the Holocaust. Do you think that the Holocaust is, in fact, the largest part of diaspora Jewish identity for a lot of Jews? I feel like the more distant you are from Judaism, the more it is just the Holocaust, especially for Ashkenazi Jews, that their Jewish identity is comprised of, if they're not Israeli. I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of sense to that. Like, obviously, we can't really quantify how much, a part of Judaism it is percentage-wise, but I feel like the Holocaust is certainly the foundation, not just of Judaism, but of like the entire liberal order. Like, when we think of the reasons we reject fascism and, other forms of authoritarianism, I think it probably all begins with Auschwitz. Like, it's totally shaped, post-World War II.
To a large degree. And I think that similarly, there's an argument that's where anti-nationalism comes from, and then anti-race realism or anti-evolution / hereditarianism.
Certainly.
It comes from sort of comes from like colonialism / slavery to a degree. I think that those are the big the colonialism, slavery is for the sort of foundation is for that, as the sort of anti-nationalist, anti-Western stuff stems from the Holocaust and World War II.
Yeah, Kevin MacDonald tries to talk a lot about the insidious Jewish influence in anthropology, where according to him, like, it started out basically Darwinian in nature, which is to say, like, it was very interested in, physical classification of mankind into, species, or not species, but into like groups and subgroups and subgroups, and then had a very sort of like nature red in tooth and claw view of the world, where like, ancient, tribes were constantly conquering other ancient tribes and, executing all of the men and taking the women as captives. And then Franz Boas comes along, he's a Jewish German anthropologist, and like turns it on its head and makes it all about culture and denies the existence of race and all of those things. But what's interesting, and one of the things that MacDonald doesn't talk about, is that he didn't really start like taking that tack until later in his career. So he sort of like accepted the more Darwinian, hard sciencey approach to anthropology, but like in reaction to like the rise of Nazism and their like going overboard with the race science, he sort of went like he swung the pendulum really far in the opposite direction. I think there's a lot to be said about the idea that because the Nazis went so far in one direction, we've just like gone a complete 180 and gone as far as possible in the other. Although the pendulum is now swinging back, in my opinion.
Yeah, I largely agree. And this time it's swinging back in a factually accurate manner, unlike a lot of the sort of pseudoscience of the Germans during that period.
I think so. Like, this is like the real root of my issue with the alt-right. The real reason, like, I'm scared of them and even more scared of like the left is because like if some sort of race realism turns out to be correct, like I want the left or at least the center to like not deny it until the very last minute, at which point it will probably be too late. Like we need to sort of find a way to accommodate this sort of like hereditarianism into, polite society so that we don't end up like accidentally ceding all of our ground to the neo-Nazis and thereby granting them lots of like false legitimacy by just like handing them the truth on a silver platter and just never acknowledging it. I don't know if that makes sense.
If they have the truth on their side, why shouldn't we be granting them the truth on a silver platter? Who do you think should be? I mean,
what I mean is that
this is where I come from, kind of, not quite coming at it from the same perspective, but to a large degree, like my sort of repatriationist stance is where I perceive that coming from. But I'm curious to hear what your angle on this is.
On what? Sorry.
No, I'd just like to hear you elaborate on that point because I think it's an interesting point to make. It's an interesting way of putting it.
Oh, just that, like, so, if you spend all of your time saying that race realism and like heritability of IQ differences across groups is like totally evil and verboten and equivalent to neo-Nazism, and then it turns out 10 years down the line that it's some version of it is actually true. Like you've told everyone that the truth is inherently neo-Nazi, right? So now I know that the alt-right doesn't identify as neo-Nazi, but I'm just using this as a shorthand. So like right now, like, and these issues are almost totally unspeakable, in the center left and really in the Overton window. Like, as you well know, I'm sure it's like extremely dangerous to talk about any of these things. But I mean, this is an insane like social arrangement to be in because like we're not hedging at all. Like, if race realism and that sort of thing turns out to be true, then we're just going to be giving like tons of legitimacy to the only people who are willing to say it out loud, who happen to be like our greatest enemies. That's what I'm scared of. Like, I want the left to start popularizing like some of this. I guess I've heard it called the Darwinian left, like a version of the left that isn't.
Have you heard of the alt left, perhaps? B.H. Rabbit, Pill Eater.
Yeah, I'm not a super big fan. I'm more a fan of, Peter Singer, the philosopher?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, he's like one of my 5 biggest intellectual heroes. And he coined the term hereditarian left not in this context. Basically, he was arguing for, I think that like, traits like intelligence in general are in fact heavily biological and currently immutable to a large extent again. But that shouldn't make us necessarily abandon, various leftist positions because that's, in that case, intelligence and other heritable traits are just as much a matter of luck as just, being born to rich parents. So maybe the left can make some room for that stance. I want to make room for the possibility of race realism in the left without like going overboard into total like intolerance. But you may feel differently. Like that may if your goal is to like get all the Jews to Israel and get them to stop miscegenating, then
your intolerance only assists me in my quest.
Exactly. Maybe like it's best to like accelerate the process as fast as possible.
Go full acceleration, rev up the ovens. Yeah. Basically my end. To some degree, I see what you mean. Yeah. Ideally, I'm a man of peace, but I'm also a bit of a radical, and I think that this has to do with the fact that I am young and comfortable to some degree, and therefore I can afford to be very ideological, and that's why I'm moving. I'm making aliyah myself within the next few years of my life as my own personal sort of plan and goal, because I think it's a challenge and a test, and I think that it's a way of showing dedication to my people. I want my children to be able to grow up in Israel. I used to feel kind of, I guess I would describe it, I didn't like feeling like, sort of like a weird looking ethnic like, I felt like a weird looking white person, basically. I felt like I didn't quite feel like a classic American or European white, and I didn't quite feel like and of course I felt atomized in New York, and I didn't feel like I belonged to any other ethnic group, and because I didn't have the religious component present, and also because I wasn't Ashkenazi or fully Ashkenazi, I didn't really feel that like much like I fit into the quote Jewish mold. So I really just sort of felt very atomized, and going to Israel and seeing the people there very much gave me a sense of being grounded. And I felt like, even if I will always be this sort of New York cosmopolitan, like very kind of like open and somewhat hedonistic type.
You will definitely always be a New York cosmopolitan.
Yeah. Maybe I can wish something slightly better for my children, at least, that they don't have to, have the same, they don't have to be wandering Jews like me, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are entirely understandable reasons. Like, you will not be the first person who feels a little out of place, and I can certainly relate to that, although I had maybe a smoother sense of identity growing up because I am more or less white passing, although I am, as far as I know, 100% Jewish. But congratulations on your Aliyah. Maybe someday I'll be forced to join you.
Well, I doubt you'd very much like that. It probably would be a lot less comfortable for most American Jews to be in Israel. It's probably much less comfortable for anyone to be.
I feel like I'll be really bad at Hebrew.
Yeah, yeah, it's not an easy language. I'm going to go through my Ulpan soon. I'm learning it on my own time right now, and it's not exactly very easy. What do you think of Greg Johnson? Your voice sounds kind of similar to his.
Oh, is that good or bad? I'm not sure if I've ever heard him speak. I've read like a little bit of Countercurrents, but not that much. I remember reading about how he was involved in some sort of drama with like Richard Spencer, which was hilarious.
Oh yes, they have a bit of a feud going on, but I don't think it's anything too serious.
I fucking love radicalism of all stripes because it's so internecine all the time, and so like backbiting and petty and facile. It's like
it's a bit much. Like, it's a bit much, yeah.
I love it, and it's just like so nice, like seeing patterns that apply, to these incredibly disparate parts of the spectrum. Because like I watch like them turning on each other while at the same time watching like tankies decide to like form circular firing squads and like all excommunicate each other from proper Marxist-Leninist praxis or whatever. It's really great. But I don't actually know that much about Greg Johnson other than that he's gay, and this has apparently inspired some antipathy towards him. I know that his publishing house publishes Savitri Devi's poems.
Oh yes, yeah.
Unbelievably fucking funny.
Savitri Devi is a bit much, yeah. She borders LARPy harpy territory.
It's like there can be no like bigger indictment of white nationalism that they think this garbage is actually worth reading.
Yeah, not just Savitri Devi. Are you familiar with Sinead McCarthy by any chance?
I don't think so.
Oh yeah, never mind. She's just sort of kind of like the modern iteration of Savitri Devi. Oh, Savitri Devi. Okay, okay. If you were to don't look at it at a very literal level. The idea of the Jew as the sort of iteration of the cosmic bringer of the Kali Yuga is somewhat valid in the sense that we are in a way kind of the OG, longest spanning people in a diaspora. Our curse of the diaspora, which was uniquely given to us by God, could arguably be interpreted in a way that's even coherent with both like historical happenings and sort of like even Jewish theology somewhat with the Savitri Devian interpretation. The only thing is I want to get us out of this age. I don't want us to be the sort of conduits of the Kali Yuga. I want us to return to being a normal people again. But yeah, I agree. Savitri Devi is kind of a bit.
Is the Kali Yuga like the fifth age? It's like the penultimate one, right?
I believe so. Yes, I believe it is the fifth age.
Yeah, like I want us to get to the next Yuga, which I want to happen through transhumanism, at which point ethnicity and tribe will just simply be irrelevant.
Interesting. All right. So here we get into some divergent area. Before we do that, I'm curious. Hold on. What do you think of Robert Lindsay?
I'm not sure I know him.
He runs an interesting blog, and I think you might have some stuff in common. You might agree with some of what he has to say. Yeah, you should definitely look into Robert Lindsay because he is basically, I guess, on like the HBD left or whatever you'd like to call it. He briefly associated, or to some degree still somewhat associates with effectively the sort of BH Rabbit type people. I'm curious, what turned you off of those people? Sorry, go ahead.
Part of it is that I don't really know much about them. I've been to BH Rabbit's website once, but I couldn't really figure out, or I can't remember if I did figure out, whether there was any real difference between him and the alt-right. I was probably looking for like, at the time I was probably looking for like his stance on the Jewish question specifically, and maybe it was similar enough to the alt-right that I was just like, oh, this guy's alt-right, or like alt-right enough for my purposes. Yeah, I don't know. So the argument for cosmopolitan that I call that cosmopolitanism that I more or less sketched briefly earlier, I still find kind of convincing, which is that like the country you were born into is entirely a matter of chance. Like there's nothing special about it. So why should you base all of your loyalties towards it?
Because your ancestors worked to preserve this lineage.
Yeah, but why is my obligation? Why is my primary obligation to my ancestors? I mean, I can understand the emotional force, but I'm not sure I'm sensitive to it. Like logically or conceptually, you know, why do my countrymen owe my primary loyalty over others? I think there are actually good answers to this. I don't mean to be suggesting this as a definitive knockdown argument. I'm just saying this is probably why I'm. If maybe I'm misunderstanding, but if the question is why I still manage to reject nationalism, or I'm still somewhat antipathetic towards it, it's because like it just feels like it's so much based on arbitrariness and circumstances of birth, and it's really, really, really hard emotionally for me to get over that. Like it's really hard for me to force myself to prefer fellow Jews over like random fellow, whatever, Black Americans or whatever.
Oh. Well, I mean, I'm curious, how would you feel living in how would you feel living in a nation of all Westerners, Europeans, with a homogenous, unified culture?
I think that would be great. Like, I'm definitely culturally chauvinistic, so I'm in favor
How about Africans? With a homogenous, unified culture. Let's say, well, not even necessarily like a nice place in West Africa or in East Africa, but maybe in like Central Africa, like in the Congo.
Assuming that it was like
it's not the capital city.
Sure, but what are you assuming in this hypothetical? Like
I don't know. It's Haiti. It's
yeah, I definitely want
impoverished village in Haiti.
Yeah, definitely not. I would want to live in the first world, to be sure.
I see. I'm okay. It's really interesting that you've been following all these people that I've been following for so long. I'm sorry, I'm not quite as articulate as I am normally right now.
Oh, no worries. Neither am I. It's really late, even for me.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe we could just like trade, random fringe bloggers that we both come across.
Absolutely, that sounds like a plan. If you'd like to listen off right now, go for it, and I can listen back to this later on. And if you have the link, you can do the same thing.
Oh yeah, sure. I was being slightly facetious. Like I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if there's any that you'd like to shout out to the audience, though, that you think are worthwell reading.
Well, my favorite blog is that one that I mentioned earlier. It's called Slate Star Codex. I found that it's like one of the only centrist/leftist blogs that I've seen right-wing radicals endorse. And he has like the amazing like honor of being one of the only people who's on like very polite speaking terms with both Mencius Moldbug and Nathan Robinson of Current Affairs. He's like I don't know if you know about Current Affairs. It's like a popular DSA-ish, yeah. online magazine. Well, it's really just a blog parading as a magazine. But yeah, like it's bizarre that like he's like writing like, you know, having productive conversations with both the relatively far left and the super far right. I don't know anyone else who's capable of like bridging those gaps. But he writes about a million kinds of things, and I don't know how to easily summarize his like output. But he's the one I think who's been doing the most to like advance this notion of the hereditarian left, because I think he's very much on it, or rather a Darwinian left, as Peter Singer would say. That's the main blog I tell all my friends about.
Do you support capitalism, or how do you feel about capitalism? You do?
Yes, absolutely.
But how can you be like a techno-futurist type? Like you still want capitalism in that age of abundance?
Well, no, sure. If we eliminate scarcity, then I'm fully, you know, copacetic with like what's it called, fully automated luxury gay space communism. Like whatever, we can just do whatever we want. But I think that like the best way past capitalism is through it. Like the best way to end scarcity is to ramp up the capitalism, possibly as much as possible within some limits.
But don't you think we could end scarcity today to some degree?
No. I mean, we could definitely like cure hunger, but that's very different. Like world hunger or African hunger, but that's very different from ending scarcity. Like ending scarcity means like we've automated basically everything and no one really has to work. Like we can all live charmed lives doing nothing or pursuing, you know, artistic, you know, pursuits or whatever. Yes, I'm like learning more about communism and communist culture definitely made me much more sympathetic to capitalism than I ever was before it. Like it almost radicalized me in like the ANCAP direction. Not exactly ANCAP, but like I just like fucking hate communism. It's so ridiculously stupid.
Really interesting. I'll ask you about that in a sec. Someone in the chat is curious to hear what you think about Slavoj Žižek.
Someone called him like a raccoon that was like digging around in the garbage behind us university library that got turned into a human by a witch. And I think that's like my assessment of him. He's just like, as I said before, like a crazy postmodern comedy routine. I really love him. Like ironically, but I don't never actually like tried to take his work seriously.
He has a very good analysis of right wingers, I think.
Oh really? I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, it's sort of the refutation of the concept of the right wing authoritarian personality. It's really good.
I think that he should have just like his own talk show on Fox or something. It would be really fucking funny. I would watch every single week.
Yeah, that would be pretty funny. Someone in the chat has some questions for you.
Oh sure. Sorry, I haven't.
A gentleman whose name means an emperor of, I forget the era, but an emperor of a certain era. He's asking in the chat if you could read that. Well, someone says Neg Johnson, and then someone says, I'm kind of an old world repatriationist. I don't think the New World has been that great even for European peoples, if we are honest with ourselves. For instance, alienation is probably most acute in America. Your guest sounds like he's afraid to preserve civil society, liberalism. Your guest sounds like he wants to preserve liberalism, civil society, etc., because he's afraid of neo-Nazis taking over. But neo-Nazis really aren't a threat to the U.S. empire. Let's be real. Neo-Nazis don't even know what they want.
I agree. Sorry. For some reason, I can only see like some of his messages and not all of them. It's really weird. Yeah, I was definitely like being a little hyperbolic. I don't think that I'm actually going to die in the ovens. But at the same time, like, I can definitely see America becoming a more dangerous place because of like proliferating and omnipresent street violence like there was in the Weimar. Things can definitely get like really, really bad here, and I hope they won't, but I'm a lot less confident in the future than I used to be. And so I feel like, given that most of my family was in suspiciously similar circumstances, like I should be a little more paranoid than I would otherwise be comfortable with. But sorry. Yes, I definitely do want to preserve civil society and liberalism. I really like civil society and liberalism, although I'm no longer like confident that it's sustainable. Men are just literally dropping out of society en masse. There's a lot of good to say about Japan and its social arrangements. It's a great country in many respects, but like, it's like
someone's bourgeois utopianism in the chat, by the way.
Yeah, well, I think.
What? Quite the capitalist. All right. What do you think of corporatism? That's the thing, is I have a hard time understanding the concept. So I was actually hoping that I can give my best shot at it, but I'm not sure if it would be the best analysis. I think it's sort of an integrated system wherein the government exercises sort of a partial ownership or control over resources with corporations acting as sort of semi-intermediary processes, sort of intermediary agents in some capacity, or also I think government-owned corporations are also. Well, I'm just curious how capitalist are you? Because I meet some people in New York. Like, I'll literally meet some people. In fact, a lot of them tend to work in finance, but they'll have these really fairly radical libertarian positions. And it's not just on things like taxes. They will really, really dislike the government in a lot of ways. And even a lot of people who work in business and a lot of other areas in New York. Surprisingly, the most common right-wing position to have is economic in New York City.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, so very big on like epistemic humility, which is to say, when I know that I don't know something, I'm generally agnostic about it. My knowledge of economics by many standards, so I don't take positions other than like capitalism overall is good and socialism is bad. I think there's probably I think that like there's probably a range of acceptable formulations of it, but I'm really not the right person to ask. I'm sorry, this is a really terrible answer, but I would just sound stupid if I like pretended like I had a coherent answer here.
No, I don't mind. Yeah. See, I'm not afraid to sound stupid when I don't have the coherent answer. That's why I have a YouTube channel.
Well, maybe if I streamed long enough, I would overcome stubbornness.
No, I sound stupid all the time. That's most of my streams. Someone in the chat says there's an argument made by some academics about how modern Japanese society is alienating because capitalist market economy is not well fit for the old samurai traditional lifestyle for Japanese men. I sort of agree with that argument, actually.
Well, in some ways, it seems like a perfect fit in the sense that they sort of like transpose the entire structure of like feudal loyalty from, samurais to daimyos or whatever they were called. I'm like flexing my rudimentary knowledge of Japanese culture here onto corporations. So you basically like latch onto, like a person just latches on to a corporation like a barnacle and expects it to take care of them in exchange for like eternal fealty. Like that's like the best possible fit in some ways.
Yeah, except it's much more of a, is interesting, this is the conception, the difference between the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft society. I forget again who the name of the person who talked about this, hold on. But it's sort of the contractual versus relationship, the contract-based versus the relationship-based civilization, where on one hand you have like either a sort of a left-wing capitalist, or let's say even like a far-right libertarian or ANCAP, or other sort of anarchist, very atomized, individualized civilization that's very contractual and contract-based, as opposed to like maybe voluntarist type thing, as opposed to a civilization like a theocratic or communist or fascist or otherwise sort of like group or tribalist, sort of like community-based, sort of like with civilization that starts not just from the family and working relation inside out, but just from the sort of basic unit and working outwards in concentric circles, as opposed to a contract-based society. What do you think of that distinction? Do you think that that's a distinction of value to be made?
This is again where I would probably plead the fifth. I haven't like researched either of the alternatives very heavily, so I don't really know. I would say that like.
Well, I was just sort of decrying the contractual civilization. I think that that's a big problem today, and I think that that's a problem. That's a problem in if you're looking at the contracts between let's say pledging your fealty to a corporation and to a feudal lord. You have the personal relationship there with the feudal lord.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the neo-reactionaries would be all about that sort of like self, like
oh hell yeah,
indentured servitude. I find it scary, but I'm not sure that's a good reason to reject it. So I don't know. I'll think about it when I'm forced to, but not until then.
Yeah, if you need to leave and get some sleep at any point, feel free to let me know. But
Sure
I'm
thing.
actually really enjoying this conversation.
Thanks.
Robert says, yeah, thanks for joining me. Robert says, with the Jap, if you do you have Discord by any chance?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Although
I'll
I've
put my
never used it
Discord in the
before.
chat.
And
just make note of this.
yeah, I'm Antigonus on Discord.
Yeah, I'll post it in the chat. Oh, I think you added me. You added
Oh yeah,
me.
I did earlier this evening.
Let's see. Robert says, what the Japanese have done with it, I would say, is more synergistic. And then the other fellow says, I've overheard it in a Benjamin Ellman talk. I'll look into it further. One of the graduate students posed a question on Tokugawa social relations being radically different from modern ones. I'll get back to you on that, Babs. The corporation is alienating, though. I agree. The corporation itself is inherently alienating. And I also think the problem I have with capitalism is, from my perspective, and you'll have to understand this, is that capitalism inherently is anti-nationalist and anti-traditional. It's a liberalizing force. As my other guest said previously, it arose as a force against monarchy. So from my sort of traditionalist perspective and from my identitarian perspective, you must understand why I find capitalism disconcerting.
Oh, no,
also,
I
again,
agree with that.
this is sort of my bourgeois critique of capitalism, and I'm coming from a rather comfortable place myself. So take what I say with a grain of salt. And I'm a very sort of like in my own head kind of person who isn't necessarily living in reality. Again, I'm a romantic, but I'm just putting these ideas out there. You see what I mean, right?
Yeah, I've kind of sympathized with Nick Land's response, which is that capitalism is basically inevitable, and any attempt to stop its corrosive acids from atomizing society is doomed to fail. Like, I'm not sure I'm an accelerationist in the sense that I wanted to speed up that process, but I agree that it's inherently anti-reactionary and anti-traditional.
Yeah.
Be honest with me. Do you really think that like Israel will exist in 200 or 300 years? I mean, it doesn't have to be Israel and really any nation state.
No, but I think that there probably will be some presence of Hebrew population, and there probably will be Hebrew polity in that region of land. And the bodies that are buried there today will probably still be buried there, and a lot of the archaeological remnants of what exists today will probably still be there. So I think that, yeah, there will be some sort of Hebrew civilization in the Levant, and I wish to be the extension of that ancient civilization.
I mean, it would be nice to be an extension of that ancient civilization, but I just don't really believe that it will exist meaningfully. Like, it's clearly, assuming
it's gone and it's ebbed and waned and flowed. But I think that ultimately, roughly speaking, all around the world, generally speaking, things change, but things also more or less broadly consistently stay the same. Even if you look at ancient times and of ancient peoples, you can track certain elements of cultures. Even the mixings of even ancient population migrations. For instance, you can track certain traits, cultural traits and linguistic traits and genetic traits to, let's say, Indo-European or indigenous European hunter-gatherer or Eastern sort of Mediterranean farmer populations that became modern European populations. I think that ancestry is, again, it's sort of an important thing. Even from a purely materialist standpoint, if we don't have that, what do we have aside from sort of Epicurean or hedonistic pursuits? Which that's a valid argument if you're willing to make that. But from
anyone's like, first of all, I'm not even sure like humans will be able to identify with any particular ethnic heritage. Like, I have no way of proving this or really predicting the future. This is just where my priors lie. Like, I just feel like we're going to have however you'd phrase that. I guess my answer is like probably nothing, but that's okay. Like, let's just all be atomized. Atomization is great if you like learn to enjoy it. Goyam.
Sorry. So anyway, hold on. Give me just one moment. See, atomization. I think that there's always going to be a drive against atomization within humans. Insofar as we are social creatures.
Sure, I'm not being serious. Like, I don't think I could ever convince anyone to want to be atomized. I think it's just like an inborn personality
trait. But I also think that there's a push for atomization because of certain things like capitalism and other factors of modernity.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that technology is going to change fast enough that it's going to make national and genetic distinctions more or less irrelevant.
Yeah, but you're for preserving the humans.
Yes, but I don't think
they're... to the humans. Because
humans
what else do you
exist.
have in your little materialist world without God? You only have the humans who are inevitably going to die because of universe heat death, probably. So there's no point. There's no hope. Give up hope. Embrace God.
I mean, I see the argument, like, clearly, like, everything is going to die eventually, but that's not a reason to reject.
Yeah, dude, just give up, dude. Just go full antinatalism.
But on the same time, on the same, by the same token, like, you can go to the other extreme. Like, there's probably no point in laboriously building a giant house if you know it's going to just be like knocked over by a storm tomorrow. Yeah. So the question is, like, where does the project of creating a nation state like lie on that spectrum? And for me, it lies.
It can be like a Nietzschean thing. Like, even if you don't like believe anything matters, you can still like kind of have this drive to overcome that and forge your own path.
Yeah, I could, but I don't see why I would. Starting out as a very non-tribal person, like.
Well, isn't that like sort of like making a career in New York City, arguably, unless you already come from a sort of nice background already?
How do you mean?
I mean, I don't know. Like, why do you do anything? Like, why does anyone do anything? Like, what drives you? Do you have like a Faustian will to succeed? Like, well, why do you give a shit about anything? Why do you not just like give up tomorrow if you're an atheist?
Right.
I'm curious because like there were periods when I was an atheist. And
so I'm not presenting. Depressed. I'm not exactly presenting this as an argument for why you should stop caring about this or stop wanting to contribute to the Jewish nation state. Like, if that's, your napalm, then I'm all for it. But I'm trying to say, like, from my perspective, given like my starting point of like, priors and preferences, like the transience of like our nation state seems like a really powerful argument for me to not care. Whereas, like, I could be like doing other activities like playing video games or reading interesting things that I do care about.
So are you like some sort of Epicurean or hedonist, like by philosophy?
Not, I mean, practically, yes. Like, I would definitely like, I definitely would be willing to contribute to certain long-term projects, like the preservation of humanity. Like, if I thought there was like some imminent, asteroid that was about to crash into the earth and exterminate life, but there was something we could do about it and I could actually actively help at great cost to myself, then sure, I like to think that I would do that. But I mean, I already have like a really nice state in America. Like, I'm really comfortable here. I grew up here. This is my home.
To the extent New York City is America.
Yeah, I'm not in New York City anymore. I was just born there and I went to school there.
Oh. Someone in the chat says, Robert says, the stream has been crapping out. People are not wired to be atomic. We are wired to be herd beasts, unless you are pretty far up on the IQ bell curve, in which case you are an outlier. And I would tend to agree with Robert. And he says the Westphalian, and then the other fellow says the Westphalian nation state is not the end all of ethnic-based societies. And I absolutely agree. And that's actually something that I was just about to say in response to you. I was going to say, I don't care about Israel specifically. I don't really even particularly like Israel as in fact, it's probably one of my least favorite iterations of the Hebrew polity or this nation state, Israel. for the Jews. But I think that individual nation states aren't worth getting attached to, but I think that identity does run deeper than that. And I advocate for non-nation states as civilizations usually, which is why I usually don't call myself a nationalist. And Robert also says that sounds very hedonistic / nihilistic, TBH. Do you have any responses to any of those comments?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to disagree that most people are wired to be atomic, and I'm definitely a psychological outlier. Like there's literally experiences that I'm sure most people have, and I just never have. Like I've never just really felt really happy to be part of a team, and I know that there's an actual experience there that I'm simply missing. I've just felt entirely individualistic. I don't know how to account for it. Maybe I was just born defective or something. I'm not really sure what to say.
It's okay. It's okay. I'm here for you. This channel will be your support group. All 6 audience members are here for you.
We should do some trust falls.
Robert says, culture, trust falls. We can do a beanie toss around the room and not say our name.
That's good.
Robert says, culture generally moves forward and fundamentally alienates those of the previous eras, though that is happening at a much faster rate in the past 150 years. And I would tend to agree with him. Do you agree with the sentiment?
Yeah, I do. It's really boring when people are talking and they agree on everything. So I'm sorry to be boring, but I think that the pace of cultural change is accelerating out of control, and that any attempts to make an island of stability there are probably going to be futile.
What do you think of the 60s? And their significance in American culture?
So I can appreciate the sort of traditionalist right-wing critique of them, but at the same time, I'd be lying if I said I'm not happy that they happened. Again, I am atomized. I'm really happy the way that I am, and I have the 60s to credit for that. I would simply be disingenuous if I condemned it.
What do you think of the sexual revolution? I'm curious. I think that there's some really interesting perspectives on this. If I recall him correctly, F. Roger Devlin, right before a good friend of mine, Adam Wallace, spoke, F. Roger Devlin spoke I don't believe it was, I forget, it was either the London Forum or the Extremists Club, and it was a brilliant speech. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the sexual revolution.
So, I mean, the only real critique I've seen of it is from have you heard of the term the manosphere?
Yes, I have. It's a pretty broad, overreaching term. I think it applies to a lot of different movements.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the classic, artiste, sexual market economics.
Yeah, he's one of the first NRX types I found. I think I must have been 12.
I don't think he would describe himself that way anymore.
He's one of the first NRX aligned people, sort of. He's borderline NRX in some areas. And I remember I found his blog. I must have been 12 or 13 or something like that. It was literally, I think, a decade ago. Crazy.
That must have been extremely traumatizing for you.
Yeah, Roy or something. Roy something he was called.
Royce.
Yeah.
Royce.
Yeah, Royce. That's what it was.
Yeah. I have a lot of beef with him. I think he's awful. But at the same time, sometimes awful people have important truths to impart. Sorry, I forgot what we were talking about.
Chateau Hartiste, the Manosphere. I asked you about the sexual revolution. Do you support it? Do you think the sexual revolution is good? I think the sexual revolution, especially in the multiracial context, has harmed Jewish men and men from other Asian groups.
I mean,
not to necessarily to that strong of a degree, but from the degree that we wish to preserve our identity. And this is the brain drain thing aside, I think that it's been bad for us, the sexual revolution, in the context of a multiracial society,
I probably agree with that. And although I think that the bulk of the damage was probably caused just by contraceptives, Japan doesn't have a huge amount of feminism, but their birth rates have totally plummeted, and they're just very rapidly becoming geriatric. So I think it's a lot. It's a lot easier to blame. Like, so a lot of the alt-right really likes to harp on about the sexual revolution precisely because they can pin it on Jews. And so my response is always to point to Japan and say, like, this is more or less universal across first world countries. This is the inevitable outcome of capitalism, unrestrained. So yeah, I think its impact is probably overstated. Also, like, because I've already struck a note of transhumanism, I think that like we should totally like invest a lot of money into building sex bots, and maybe we can satisfy people, you know, lonely needs desire for companionship that way. That's probably a more realistic way of like doing so than like turning back the clock and returning to like 50s era society with, you know, monogamy and so forth.
This is the sort of hedonistic Epicurean thing emerging, rearing its head again. Is how I'm perceiving this.
Yeah, come join the dark side. It's great. Everyone gets a sex spot.
Yeah, I mean, I've been there.
You can.
As a matter of fact, there's even sort of an underground basement music venue.
Sorry, you're breaking up.
No, I was just saying, like, I've been to the dark side. There's a wall on an underground sort of warehouse venue in Brooklyn that has my name written on it in the bar section. Like, I've lived, you know, the most sort of degenerate aspects, and I mean, honestly, that's kind of what made me realize that whole thing is just I just felt sort of bitter and sad after a while of it, after indulging in sort of the most raw forms of hedonism of all varieties during my sort of later teenage years.
You really need to watch Ghost in the Shell enough times that you start to get excited about the aesthetics, the vaporwave aesthetics of the future.
Yeah, Ghost in the Shell isn't bad, I have to agree. You're making an argument from Ghost in the Shell.
Exactly.
Of transhumanism. Do you see the comment in the chat for you? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure I do. It's behaving weirdly for me. Apologies.
The chat says, will this tech development and melting humanity seep into the more insular societies of the Far East as well? The Chinese are strictly regulating market development, state capitalism for this reason. They have a literal firewall to prevent non-Chinese internet access, which is probably not a bad idea if the internet must exist, TBH.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how like really sustainable that is. Like, I mean, obviously we're in like, the internet is new, so we're covering totally new ground, so you have no idea what's going to be effective. But it feels just like a Band-Aid solution. Like, I think a lot of people have access to VPN. If they don't now, then they certainly will in the future, because they'll, you know, children are more tech savvy, and I'm sure it's going to become easier and easier to find ways of routing around it because it's profitable. The Chinese have a fairly interesting approach to like restraining the forces of capitalism. So I think they might ban companies from doing corporate lobbying. I'm not sure about that, but I do believe that, I'm pretty sure that, like, you know, most large companies have like a C-level position, which is basically just like a deputized, you know, state representative who's making sure that nothing that happens undermines the general will of the party. So there is like, you know, there are definitely interesting way and only partially explored ways of like keeping capitalism in check and not having it not destroy traditional society, but I'm fairly pessimistic about the prospect of them working out over the long term. I think capitalism is a scary, inhuman monster that's too big for any of us to control or contain.
Yeah, I somewhat agree. Let's see. I shut off Discord so the beeping should stop.
I didn't hear that.
Robert says, fundamentally, I tend to like the Jungian approach. There will always be people that fall into specific roles, and society revolves around the built-in evolutionary development of these roles. And so this is sort of a materialist explanation of Nietzschean archetypes, and I somewhat agree, although I don't necessarily come to it from a materialist aspect. I can think of it sort of in the sense of cosmic order. I think that there are roles. You can even look at it in a sort of Ganonian or Evolian, although Evolian had the caste order somewhat mixed up, sort of Brahmin, Kshatriya, etc., sort of caste, Vaishya, Sudra caste hierarchy system. I'm curious, what do you think of this? What do you think of, I guess, a Jungian angle or a cosmic order concept?
I don't think very highly of it. I come from a very like analytic philosophy type background, so I feel like I'm just like constitutionally unable to understand what it means. Same thing with most of Nick Land and Zizek. Sorry to disappoint.
Let's see. Robert says, for tech, I want prosthetic bodies now, please. If we get
totally.
to that point, epic dystopia will be a very clear and present danger, though. We will have a true god tier caste in society that develops out of that.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
It'll be Elysium. Do you want Elysium? Do you want there to be technarchs?
I think that would be an incredibly cool future. That would be fun to inhabit.
The other fellow says civic feminism, quote unquote, had its impacts on Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, following the Western liberal democratic model of giving more, quote, civic/labor rights to women. So it is partially feminism too. And I think feminism also, what people overlook is the negative effects of feminism on Israel. And I think that feminism has also had negative effects on India as well. So non-Islamic South and West Asian nations, even Kurdistan to some degree, have had a lot of feminist infiltration, ideologically speaking. And I think that Asia has fallen prey to a lot of negative aspects of Enlightenment and modernistic ideologies and their offshoots and implications.
I mean, given that feminism sort of invented the idea of women participating in the labor force in all the same positions as much as men, then yeah. But I don't think it really came about in Japan as like a mass feminist movement in the way that it did in the West. I think just like the needs of an industrial society are such that, you know, there's a lot of money to be made by working. And so people will just naturally start working. Like I would describe it, Saudi Arabia is like one of the least feminist places on earth, but they have huge, you know, labor force full of women. And it didn't come about like through any feminist wave. It's just, you know, capitalism demands workers, and so the workers will show up. And if they're women, then so be it. I mean, again, feminism as like an ideology may have let the genie out of the bottle, but the genie is fully.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Just testing. Okay. What do you think of, what do you call it? I was going to say a sort of space travel, but in general, what do you think of ideas of both space travel and sort of exploration and other sort of Faustian or Promethean, as some would characterize it, pursuits like that? Do you think they're worthwhile?
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I don't think anyone on Earth is going to say no to that question. I'm pessimistic about the prospect of colonizing other planets in even the medium-term future, like 1,000 years. It's probably too difficult. But you know, if we survive longer than that, then probably all bets are off. So let's do it.
So, what about mining asteroids?
Oh, that's probably more realistic, and like space tourism would probably be a thing within our lifetimes. It sort of already is.
SpaceX, Tesla, hell yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Tesla's a race realist. You know, as are a lot of these types of people, if I'm not mistaken. Mencius Moldbug had like an election day overnight slumber party with.
With Elon Musk. Or sorry, Peter Thiel.
Peter Thiel, yeah.
Yeah, that was really hilarious.
Yeah, like, wouldn't be surprised if Elon Musk got an invite too.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun watching like the sort of progressive reaction to that fact. Like it was like such a vindication of everything they believed about Peter Thiel, that he was actually in fact, you know, an anti-democratic neo-reactionary fascist or whatever they would want to have called him. I work in tech, so there's a lot of backlash to Peter Thiel.
I was just in Silicon Valley, and I had such unpleasant experiences with tech people. Largely, I really found them. I literally got on better with the tech marketing people, who are generally like dumber than the tech people, because the tech people were very culturally poorly rounded. You're very, very sort of culture and quite an intellectual sort of idea-oriented person for these tech people, who I think a lot of them tend to sort of, they don't really know anything about history and anthropology and stuff like that. I found from a lot of my experience, they just sort of do tech, and that's all they do.
Well, to be fair, I don't know anything about history and anthropology, so.
Or not history and anthropology, but
them.
they don't care about like philosophy. They don't care about anything beyond their little, their STEMmy bubble. I had that experience, and I felt kind of isolated when I was in SF and Silicon Valley.
Are you in academia now? Feel free not to answer if it's private.
Yes, I am.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Are you going for like a higher degree?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, well, I'll leave it there. I'm sure you don't want to dox yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. The 3 people watching or whatever, I'm sure they totally.
Yeah, you can never be too careful, though.
Yeah, I'm sure. Someone might pour over this later, but totally. I'm curious. Yeah, I mean, what are your experiences with academia? I have this sort of an extreme love-hate relationship, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, I really miss it. I'm thinking about going back. I mean, I could totally make this conversation a blog now if you want. But yeah, I mean, I think that large swaths of humanities should probably be defunded and dissolved and are probably a net negative on humanity. But then, I don't know, like, I probably only expose myself to like the most outrage-inducing, material on Twitter. So I always have to be like a little skeptical of, my extreme conclusions. Like maybe it's not as bad as like these Twitter accounts that exist solely to parody academia or like the humanities by bringing up their worst examples. Like maybe that's not, healthy. Have you heard of real peer review, by the way?
Yes, I have.
I fucking love them. So like gender studies and the various ethnic studies, like it seems like totally intellectually contentless. I'm trying not to say the sort of things that someone on the far right would say, but like this is one of my points of convergence with them. Like I think it's totally absurd that what these like ridiculous like blogs posting as peer-reviewed academic articles are. But as for the rest, like I love philosophy departments and analytic philosophy specifically. I think that should stay.
Yeah, I mean, even a lot of sociology, really sort of draws me in, or like cultural anthropology, even the sort of like extreme leftist stuff. I think I find it rather interesting, even if it's not my cup of tea. The evolutionary biology stuff and a lot of population genetics is stuff I find fascinating.
Yeah, I'm trying to learn more about that, but I'm probably not scientifically literate enough to dive super deep into it. Have you heard of what's his name, Napoleon Chagnon? I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I think it's Chagnon.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, I brought him up just because like he seems like if you're interested in anthropology and you're interested in the far right lens, then he seems like he's at the intersection of that. I've been reading one of his books. It's really interesting.
What book is that? Would you like to recommend it?
Yeah, let me find it. Sorry, I downloaded it, so I don't remember what the title was. It's Noble Savages, My Life Among Two Dangerous Tribes, the Yanomamo and the Anthropologists. Basically, like anthropology was dominated by extremely cultural heavy, Boasians or Margaret Medians or whatever the term is. And then and they like maintained certain dogmas about the nature of like primitive societies, that like warfare was fairly rare, and when it existed, it sprang from competition over finite resources, often induced by sort of like first world like intervention, and they wanted to like reduce everything to culture, and they were opposed to any sort of like biological explanations of tribal behavior. And then he walks in on this like extremely violent Amazonian tribe, comes to the opposite conclusion and determines that like there are actually evolutionary forces at play. Like, the warriors who are the most aggressive are the ones who have the most children, and that's going to induce further aggression generations down the line. And, the competition isn't over resources. It's often over like really petty fights about women and infidelity. So he got this incredibly chilled response from academics. or from his fellow anthropologists, and spent like the rest of his career more or less fighting them and trying to get his revolutionary or radical ideas accepted. It's a super gripping read. I knew nothing about anthropology before reading this. I get the sense that he's a slightly unreliable narrator, so I would take it with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Yeah, but it's not like his sort of detractors weren't, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure there's like real.
Especially
I think
if you look at someone like Boaz, who's a known fabricator.
I don't know that much about that, but
Boaz was fabricated, or sorry, no, there was something that Boaz was basically pushing this theory that was sort of a bunk theory that was pushed, or I mean, known fabricator is a bit harsh, but like he was pushing a bunk theory of Margaret Mead's about that was sort of later revealed to be largely.
Is this the
false.
coming of age in Samoa thing?
Yeah.
I should probably study this more. But yeah, I've heard that it's been discredited, and I think that like Chagnon's ideas have become a lot more accepted than they were back in the 70s with time.
There's some tons of questions in the chat building up. Is it all right if I ask you some of them? Can you look at the chat by yourself?
Sorry, I'll try.
Look at the link I posted in the Google Hangouts thing. Do you see that?
Hold on.
It's like the Google Hangouts room.
Oh.
Someone says, where would that put Alain de Benoit? Some of his essays are very anti-capitalist, and many of his anti-feminism and anti-immigration sentiments clearly place the blame on the global market economy. He's obsessed with sex. He's sort of a hedonist type, isn't he? I don't know much about his philosophy aside from just watching his school of life videos and his lectures.
I didn't know he had those. Those sound amusing.
Yeah. He's got his tentacles everywhere.
I really love it when
amazing fellow. I think he spoke at the New School once, which is sort of like a place where I used to study. It's kind of like the iteration of the Frankfurt School on the across the pond.
I really like it when like ideologues also double as like self-help gurus. I find the combination usually pretty fucking amusing. Like Stefan Molyneux is like the paradigm example of this. He's like cult leader. It's really awesome. I love this.
Except I think he's way less ideologically.
That's true.
The coherent than Alain de Benoit.
Yeah,
today, because Molyneux is going through sort of this radical chimeric transformation.
Really? Can you tell me more about that? I haven't been thinking
wouldn't you say like he used to be this sort of very staunch kind of capitalist libertarian autiste, and now he is violating all sorts of libertarian principles and rethinking the sort of the NIP in a lot of ways, and his open borders stances are sort of which he used to have.
I mean, is he drifting right?
Yes.
I mean, that seemed inevitable. Like he was clearly on very far down this path, like the pipeline from right-wing libertarianism to white nationalism.
Sorry, I'm not thinking of Alain de Benoit. I'm thinking of de Botton. Oh my gosh.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with him.
Hold on. I'm thinking, wait, hold on. Oh man, I am so tired. I was thinking of another French guy who is called what's his name? Hold on. Oh, this is so embarrassing. But I want to get this right so I can correct the audience. Alain de Benoit is someone else who I also know because I saw him speak. I think there's a video of him getting this speech. But I forget. I think it was at some conference in Europe, or maybe there was also one in America. It was either at AmRen or like some sort of like radix type event. Hold on one sec. What's the name of this guy? I can't find his name. Who's the guy who founded School of Life? Now I need to know. Alain de Botton. Yeah, Alain de Botton.
Oh wait, is this the thing that they have like those posters all over the subways in New York?
I have no idea. Yeah, maybe it is. Or maybe that's the School of Practical Philosophy.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
seeing those.
yeah, it's very similar. It's just sort of self-help type Jordan Peterson-ish stuff, I guess. Yeah.
Man,
Honestly,
that stuff
I
is
mean,
so boring.
it's not quite Jordan Peterson-ish. Like maybe that's discrediting Jordan Peterson, but it's sort of self-help-ish in the same way Jordan Peterson is. It takes like philosophy and psychology and more stuff and puts it into self-help. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of Elaine de Baton, not Elaine de Benoit. To the person in the chat. Hold on, I'm gonna read the comments and do them some justice now.
Sure.
Hold on. Give me 1 second.
By the way, sorry, I just noticed it's 4:30. I should probably go to bed.
All right, that's cool. That's cool. Do you have any concluding remarks?
No, just nice to talk to you. Thanks
for
awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on. Good night. Take care.
Take care.
All right, I'm gonna respond. Fun. If we get to that point, epic dystopia will be a very clear and present danger. Though we will have a true god tier caste society that develops out of that. Altered Carbon, another entertainment reference, has an interesting presentation of the god class versus plebes problem. I'll check that out. I think I've heard of Altered Carbon. And yeah, god tier caste society. I don't support necessarily the caste that comes out of it. I don't necessarily think I'd like that. Someone says feminism is just another facet of capitalism. I don't disagree with that. The Kurds probably just ape feminism for NATO support. I know that you're joking there, but quite honestly, I do actually think that this stuff has genuinely influenced what do you call it? Sorry, I'm quite tired. What was I saying? Oh God, yeah, this is probably where I should stop streaming. But I just sent the link for anyone who wants to come in and say any last words before I end the hangout if they have any comments to make on what they just heard. Oh yeah, Kurds aping feminism. No, I think that it's actually quite genuine. I think that both Israelis and Kurds, Jews because of the diaspora, and Ashkenazi Jews sort of bringing back these things to the Levant, and Sephardic Jews and even Mizrahi Jews, just westernized Jews, and colonialism as well. I think because of colonialism too, like Jews have a lot of these Enlightenment-ish beliefs, and I think that Kurds, perhaps for different reasons, but they also have a lot of sort of a similar kind of hard-on for these Enlightenment beliefs. It's quite shocking. Robert says feminism of the 60s/70s was also a response to the inflating economy. Supporting a single mother household was becoming too expensive for a single earner to cut it. Sorry, supporting a single household, not a single mother household. Subliminal, subconscious stuff going on there. Hold on. Feminism of the 60s/70s was also a response to the inflating economy. Supporting a single household was becoming too expensive for a single earner to cut it. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd say that that's somewhat true. Yes, there's that kind of pragmatic element to it. Nat Schlossenheimer says, an old commenter, hello, back from the old Adam Wallace days. I think it is more appropriate to say wealth rather than capitalism is being responsible for modern sexual norms, etc. It seems more specific and less vague to say it like this. And yeah, possibly, yes. It used to be we couldn't afford certain promiscuity. Now we can afford more of it, etc. I also agree. We've also decoupled promiscuity from responsibility or any sense of connection. Here. Sure, but quote, female empowerment was a direct result of needing a larger and cheaper workforce. Partially, I don't think it was necessarily that direct of a result. I'm not sure. The modern tech industry I have seen is full of cancerous people chasing that tech money while not even being interested in advancing tech, says Robert. And yes, I've seen some of that. I've also seen some people who are very, very passionate about it. And I've also seen a lot of people who are in the sort of marketing and HR and PR realms around tech and advertising, but they don't work in tech, and they do fit your description perfectly in that regard. A lot of them are just sort of general, like sort of normie extroverts of the worst variety. Someone says, yeah, it was NPI that Benoit spoke at. Yes. Um, someone says Kurds are creating the pure Antifa anarcho-communist society with U.S. support, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting, I guess, but I think there is a bit of truth to it. They really do take a lot of that particular ideology seriously. I think it has something to do with post-colonial sort of stuff going on. And someone says, let's see, promiscuity took a fundamentally different form in quote feudal societies that ended up wealthy, though not. You had mistresses or concubines where patriarchy was maintained. Interesting. Yeah, Elaine de Vaunois, Elaine de Vuitton. Pretty amusing there. Anyway, if no one wants to hop in the chat, thank you very much, everyone, for watching. It's been my pleasure entertaining you until 5:33 a.m. in the morning in New York City. Wow. Eh, unless there are any final comments, I am going to close the stream up. Rather. As Luke Ford says, bye bye.
For wife in Vegas.
You need headphones. I'm gonna mute you. There, you're muted right now. Yeah.
Enemies ahead! Enemies ahead!
No. No.
to the safe zone!